and we'll take it apart. This, well, so now I'll get on to describing things and differences here. That was part of it too, yeah, okay, more of the original. This was bolted solid originally, and what happened, somebody decided they wanted to try and do some suspension up here on the locomotive too. So, and we'll give Bert a full copy of all the before and during pictures of the locomotive, actually, that he can add into this. We could do some more voiceover if we need to, too. But we don't need to wait forever to send it out either, since this is, the kids are going to be waiting for this. I have to have it back by the 1st of May, so I've actually got quite a bit of time for the small amount of work. If we find something major and renegotiate, then that's a little different. But anyway, what they had was they had left this axle here bolted solid, and then they had this one on springs, just loose on springs. And well, if you notice that there's a connecting rod between them and a connecting rod on the other side, this axle drives with the connecting rod. There's no gear drive in between them. It's driving by the rod. So the front axle, by being on, it had some kind of a swing. I think it swung this way. Anyway, it swung on an arc, and it didn't really work. It would come around and try and beat up the side rods, and they were forever needing to mess with the side rods. Also, the side rods were unsealed, just open rods, quite a bit smaller than these. These are bigger rods. This piece here, which is just running the phony piston rod back and forth to make it look like a steam engine, it is, that's the original piece. I had to bend it out a little bit. This had to move some. I don't remember, well, yeah, no, this had to move out because we just needed more material there for what I wanted to do. The original was a much smaller bushing and a grease fitting, and the track was just covered in handfuls of grease everywhere. And they would grease it and grease it and grease it, and in a matter of half a season of running, it needed new bushings or new pins, and just, it wasn't making it. So what I have in here now, we drilled, there's a level gauge right here. We have a cap up here. There's 2 plugs underneath, a couple more plugs down there. Drilled large holes through it, all through it. So it's got somewhere around a quart of oil that it will hold inside of there in capacity. Then there's a lip seal here, a lip seal on the back, and it's still a bronze bushing, but it's totally in oil all the time. The filler up here is just a filler. That's just, we used a old style cap so that it looked old timey instead of some newer cap or a plug that you pull off. And since nobody had given instruction to one of their newer operators for the locomotive last year, he was telling me, keeps filling the cup and it sloshes out, you know, he's always losing all this oil. And then I explained to him that there's a sight glass and he was overfilling it, so it was just coming right out of the filler from the wheel going back and forth. That was just too much oil. These here, we've made bronzes for these original time, and then once more I've made new bronzes for it. The cylinder rod I replaced with stainless tubing. It originally was a solid piece of rough rod, and the big thing I was doing there, I went with stainless tubing so it would look nice and so it didn't have so much downward weight. This bushing was, the sliders were really wearing quickly on the bottom side because of the excess weight hanging out there, since there's nothing actually in the piston to hold it. On the suspension here, after I got done, we pulled apart everything. We set it up so it's a walking beam now. There's a center pivot right there. There's one walking beam plate. So there's no, no suspension between left and right. So the only suspension is this way. Which means in reality, you're going to have one of them that will tip a little bit and the other one is going to flex the plate a little bit. It's not It's not going to be the end of things, but it's going to end up flexing a little bit on that plate. It's not a true suspension component that way, but I know that it's going to. It's not going to just be lifting up a wheel. It's going to be bending a little bit, that small amount that it needs. And it hasn't broken in 19 years, so I guess that was reasonable. You do have to stop how much money you spend on things sometimes. These here were sheet metal before. They were old garbage can lids for decoration. And I couldn't find the same garbage can lid because they were 1967 popular, not current popular in 2005. So I said, well, as long as I got to replace them, instead of pounding out all this ugly sheet metal, I'll just make something that looks like an industrial cylinder head. It's not as true to the #1 locomotive as what they had before. Actually, a machined curve without the bolts would have been more authentic, but I thought this looked cool, and I didn't know any better. I didn't realize that the other's curved one was. The reason why the curved one is there on #1, which I've looked at more now because I've become more accustomed to it over the years, helping out the steam guys. It's covered with insulation. They have a head similar to this, but the part you see is covered over with insulation, and that's why that's rounded sheet metal outside is actually technically correct, even though I thought the head looked good. This here was sheet metal also, and I went ahead and we just cast this out of solid steel instead, the phony smoke box cover. They had, and part of that was anything I could put up here for more weight. They didn't have quite enough driving traction on this. I don't remember what the previous weight was. I weighed the locomotive, and I've lost my scales since then. I loaned them to somebody, I don't know who, and they never came back. I had some jump scales. But I weighed the locomotive on each of the wheels before I started. I think it was about 16,000 pounds. And I know it's right at 20,000 now when we got done. Part of what we did, we poured 2,000 pounds of lead here in the front. And there's a cavity in here, and then after we poured it, we welded a cap over it, so it's just sealed in there, but that's full of lead. And then, like I say, we cast that there. The original, when this came up, it had a timber across here. Now, down at the park, and they pulled it off for transportation, they have a regular tapered cow catcher. Somewhere along the line, somebody decided they wanted it to look more Wild Westy than authentic to #1. And that's an interesting thing, too. Side note here to part of the discussion is when they were first getting the steam locomotive done, a lot of the guys in the Friends of the Tanana Valley Railroad, because that was the original railroad here in the interior, was Tanana Valley Railroad. Started up in 1905 with #1 locomotive, first one in the interior of Alaska. And they had one in Anchorage, a locomotive that got there first, so it wasn't the first one in the state or in the territory. But pretty close the same time. I forget when the other one got here. Although the Alaska Railroad won't acknowledge that there was anything else of history. They don't, it's a toy. It was a real locomotive. It brought stuff out to the gold mines, which was the main reason for commerce here at that point in time. There was some trapping, and yeah, there was still quite a bit of trapping actually, but the gold mines were the main thing. But since they were calling this an imposter. When they were first putting the steam locomotive together, they would call this an imposter. And some of the people didn't really care for it being called an imposter. And I like the idea of it being a little brother better, myself. Also, the people in the steam locomotive club now, because they use this one sometimes for club events. If it's down below 0, water freezes. They don't have everything to deal with all the frozen water. When it gets down cold, while you can run a steam locomotive, first filling it with water, making it all go, you got to do this outside. It's a bother when it gets down too cold. So when they have, in the fall, they have some events. They have a spooky train and a Santa train, one for Halloween, one for Christmas. When they do those, if it happens to be, 20, 30 below at that time, they just turn the key on this and go vroom, because it is easier than dealing with the steam. And since they've ran it a little bit, a lot of the steam guys are not so condescending to it. But the more important point is, if this had not been here, so that they could have 0.6 of a mile circular track in Pioneer Park, there would have been nowhere to run the steam locomotive. There was no narrow gauge here. They were doing as best they could, the volunteer work, the little bit of money that was donated to get the locomotive going. If it had not had a track to go to, it would have never happened. And the fact that it is going out there also draws people for this one. I mean, they really do help each other as far as the park overall and the way things are working. It's a good thing. In the weight department here again, when this first came in, up inside of here on the sheet metal, they had grater blades, scrap pieces of shaft, and just garbage piled up in here, which really had been pulling this down and damaging it. But that was what they had for spare weight to make it have a little bit of traction. When I pulled all that stuff out and like I say, the bad suspension components, we put the lead in. We also added another flange here. We added a lot of weight just by making things heavier and stronger in a lot of places. But this body originally welded down to the frame. And what we did, we cut it loose and then we welded it to a flange that bolts down. So if you need to pull the body off for any reason, the body can now pull off. Also, the other thing that did was that allowed me to work within a reasonable time frame for what I needed to do, because I came in, we straightened up the body, got the flanges on, got it reasonable there. Then I sent it off to Top of the World Enterprises Body and Paint, which is now closed, and that belonged to Kevin Wheeler, a friend of mine, and he did the painting on it. And actually, before it went to him, it went to Greer Steel, and I had it sandblasted. So we had everything sandblasted before, but that allowed me to work with all the mechanicals here without having to deal with the body in the way or having to wait for paint, because that could go on at the same time. I didn't mention before, but this here also was a bushing with grease in it too. That's a self-aligning spherical sealed roller bearing in there now. And I don't think they've ever replaced it, but it's just moving the rod back and forth for decoration. The cab, again, how the two of them work together. The steam locomotive originally had a hardwood cab, and it was in pretty bad shape. They found in White Horse, I believe, is a twin to that locomotive. And they went and they looked at it, one of the guys in the group was cabinet maker, measured it all up. They made a beautiful cab for it, and then they just couldn't bear to paint it black like it was supposed to be. So they left it clear, just oiled. I don't think they even clear coated. I think they just oiled the wood. And it's starting to show some cinder marks and different things on the other one. But because they did that, and this one, when it was built with a plywood cab. And it had regular glass and plywood cab, cracked glass at that time, some of it. And they wanted to have a hardwood cab. That was part of the bid, was they wanted a hardwood cab where they could see the hardwood. And this, unfortunately, has weathered quite a bit. It was really pretty. The first 5 years they had this locomotive, they would bring it in about every 2 weeks, and they would clean it and chamois it and wax it by hand. And the guys, mostly due to Larry being there, who is no longer there, but they really, really cared for this at first. And I know you get to a certain point, even if you have that same care, there's going to be a point where it starts getting little nicks on the paint and different things, and you can't it won't be the same even if you do give it that much care. There's a point where it goes downhill. And anyway, so it's gotten a little more weathering to it. But the big thing, when we did the cab, and they had, on one of these two sides, they had a little short grab handle, but not on both sides. So I actually stole these off of one of my railroad boxcars because I wanted the longer handles and I wanted them to match. So I actually went out here, and I don't like stealing things off my railroad boxcars from 1942, but it looks good, and I thought it was worth putting on there. So we did two of those. The cab itself, you're gonna jump up in there to see it, but the cab itself is a metal cab. I didn't want to do, well, they requested the hardwood cab. I didn't want to just do a hardwood cab with this thing running around. I knew that it would tear the wood apart. There's just no way you would have the wood, this running around. And this train gets about 10,000 miles a year, so it's got about 190,000 miles on it. I mean, it's an amusement park ride, but it's a serious thing. The cab is all steel inside and then made with the cabinet wood that goes over it. All the windows are safety glass. It had a really bad gauge panel, little gauge panel before, so we made a bigger, better gauge panel for it, put in the fire extinguisher. The seat, originally, the gearbox came up almost as high as the gauge panel that's in here now. And you couldn't turn the seat straight forward. You could only turn it to about 45 degrees. And so it was very uncomfortable. And I didn't realize that when I first bid working on the locomotive, but when I went to pick it up, I got a chance. I drove it on the track for about 1/8 of a mile before we got to the lowboy truck. And I said, this is getting changed. This is getting changed. I knew that the drive chains were going to get changed anyway, because there's what they had, and you'll see this in the pictures. They had 2 chains on a right angle gearbox and then 2 chains down on the axle, and they're misadjusted. So you're always fighting yourself. You don't put 2 separate chains. A double roller chain is one thing, but they put chain and it was just a mistake. And that was the way it was made from the start, but it was a mistake. And to get what I wanted, to get this bump out of here, to get it out where I wanted, I made a custom axle mounted gearbox. So we actually built the gearbox. I spent a lot on doing that, but like I said, I just wanted to do a good job on a lot of this. 1266 to 1 is the final ratio. I used because I didn't make all the gears, I used I think it was a 235, 225, I don't remember, 225 or 235, somewhere I've got the part numbers. Anyway, bull gear and pinion from a Cat excavator, and then we drove that with a Dana 80 ring and pinion. And so that allowed it to go down there, and we used a double taper lock on each side of the axle, and which they're standard Dodge style taper locks. So when a person takes those off, you've got to do all the tricks because it sticks on there. I had it off the once that I did the bearings. It also had, of course, scabby wiring. It had, well, that's something too. If you go back here behind the locomotive, you can see, walk back there a little ways, and you can see that you got to go out through the lower part and go back behind it. And because if you're looking at this from the cars back here, what you see is, while you can see the black up around the windows, but you mostly see what looks like a wood cab. You don't see a steel cab, you see a wood cab with some steel around the windows. So that was the idea of mounting that up so that it nice, solid. And also the cab itself there's little pockets in here where you can get to the attachment bolts, and there's a rubber flange with rubber underneath, so it's double rubber isolated, so it's quiet. The engine originally, these are something new that's came along here. It had who was the transmission? Oh, is it still? Yeah, it should hinge up. Grab. Okay. When they first, when this was here before, they had the air compressor was mounted on the frame rail, was how it was originally built. And they could never keep the belts tight and never get enough air for the brakes. So I made a new bracket going. Now that's part of where I was saying some of that stuff where if I'd have bought a diesel engine, I could have just bought it with everything bolted on it. We had this, now they've, they've replaced the radiator this last year, and they weren't able to get the same radiator. I'm a little disappointed in, not in the radiator, but I previously had a screen that you could pick up and pull out for pulling off the birch pollen, because that was one of their original complaints. They used to have trouble in the summertime with the birch pollen gathering there. But as long as it works, it's fine. But that was something that we had done. We had screens in there. It's a Funk Reverse-O-Matic 12,000 is what the transmission was that was in here. Currently, it is the same transmission as you'd have in a JCB, a John Deere, or a Case backhoe of an 80s or 90s vintage. That same transmission also is used in boats still, made brand new still. They call it a Velvet Drive 71 series. When it's used for the backhoes, it's forward and reverse. Same thing as in the boats, except there's a torque converter. On a boat, you don't have a torque converter with it. And so it's a pretty standard piece. And then, of course, we put that in there. And that is, I don't know if they've replaced it or not. Latches like that don't usually last that long, but we put in that little neutral lock. Parking brake. Parking brake has got to be, now I'm not sure whether I put the parking brake on the transmission. We'll see, because we'll have this out later. Because we're going to pull all this out to pull the drive line out before we drop that front drive section to pull the, because we'll pull that whole section out and then we'll pull the tires off of it. Anyway, somewhere in here is a Subaru 1982-ish vintage disc brake caliper, because it had a cable actuation, and that is the parking brake. The service brakes on this, they had a problem with the service brakes before, and this had hydraulic discs on the main locomotive, and if they gave them enough pressure, they had an air can, diaphragm air cylinder, pushing on a standard Lockheed Martin, not Lockheed Martin, Wagner Lockheed brake master cylinder. And if they turned the air pressure, they had a regulator on it, if they turned the pressure up enough to where it actually stopped good, it would blow the cylinder seals out on the brake calipers. So they basically kept it where it was, with a 120 PSI system, it was putting on maybe 30 pounds of pressure is all it would do. And then they used the cars, because the cars had decent brakes. When they did the upgrade and put on the new double sets, it came with brakes, which are wheel brakes that brake right on the wheels. And I wanted to do that on these ones, but they were concerned about authorizing changes that had to do with safety equipment. So I wanted to do brakes that had shoes that went right on the wheels, because you have a nice big, and they insisted that it should still be discs since it came originally with discs on it, even though the discs didn't work at all. But I used another style, a Rockwell. It's a 4-digit number. It's a modern brake, disc brake that you use on semi trucks. And I put it on here. I've got one of them on the front, and it's on the very front axle because there wasn't enough room with the gearbox. So I put it on the front axle, so it stops that axle. The connecting rods that tie the two together, of course, is going to stop both axles. Then I have 2 brakes on the rear axle. So the rear axle had way more brake than you did on the front, which was going to be a problem. So I took the back ones, and I think they're 3-inch. I got the smallest diaphragms I could. I think they're 3-inch diaphragms, and then I could play with the length of the pivot where it operates the brake also. And I drilled an extra hole a little lower so they put out minimum pressure, and then I put an 8-inch can on the front caliper up here. And they balance out pretty good. The one thing they don't balance with, though, is the the cars. Now that this has real brakes, you pull the brake on, you will face plant. This will stop. And the guys that were used to it before, I didn't know what to expect, so I just kind of eased into it as I put it on the track and played with it. And I said, yeah, you guys are going to have to be a little careful with this. Lots of stories from people I've heard about face plants in the cab because they got a little too grabby with the brakes. Now, we had to balance the brakes again. You know, they had their little regulator down here for the ones on the car, and the full pressure went to the ones on the back, and they had a squaw handle. Well, I decided to let it, just two squaw handles. You can pull them both together, you can pull one, do whatever you want. I decided to leave it totally manual, up to the operator, and not do any fancy balancing between the cars and the locomotives. And you don't know how many cars you're going to have either. It's going to be different if I'm pulling one car versus pulling all 4. And actually, they only pull 3 because one of them is now dedicated to the steam locomotive. And sometimes the steam locomotive uses a different coupler, so it's got one car that's dedicated to it, but on the back, they can tag on and mix them, and so they can share the cars however they need to. However, this, I don't know, I think they do have power on the for the steam one now too. I think they've got some power on there. They put a battery in there, and this has got an inverter in it. So they run a 110 volt amplifier for a PA system that's in the cars. And yeah, I think they do run that from the steam one also. We had, they used to have ropes up here for everything, including for the whistles, which the whistles are interesting. I tried buying, Graham makes locomotive whistles these days, but they're for a different purpose. So I tried initially buying new whistles for this, and they just sounded really terrible. The whistles that are on here don't really sound great, but they have a distinctive sound that everyone has gotten used to on this locomotive, so they like it. So we polished those, put the original ones back on. It's got 2 tones. It's not a tritone, which is normal. I actually got into playing with whistles and collected a few, but that was after this went away. I thought about going back and giving them one of them I bought, which is a real nice tritone, but they convinced me that they actually like the kind of off 2-tone that it's had, because it's had that since 1967. So they kind of like it. So the bell, and I noticed the bearing is out, and we're going to have to talk to them about that. But the bell, when it first came in, bushings in it, and it did just like that. That is all it would do. Where it's supposed to pull it and it's supposed to go ding, 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 make at least 3 dings. Well, it's got a bad bearing now. And the thing was, originally it was bushings, and if you oiled it up right before you pulled it, it would work, but then the oil would quickly go out. And Larry requested, it was interesting, because Larry ran this most of its life, most of its first life, and he ran it the majority of its second life so far. Larry really liked the locomotive. He was the one taking care of making sure it was waxed, and he really, when it came back, he was just impressed with the change. But he told me that he wanted a ball bearing put in there. I conferred with him quite a bit while I was working on this, and that was a lot of the extra work, with stuff that wasn't written down, but that Larry, the man that was going to operate it, wanted. And he wanted a ball bearing in that. And I'll give it a hard pull and see if it'll do some. Okay, it rang okay there. Bearing must be setting a little better now than when I looked at it earlier, but it is. The center of the bearing, the balls are falling out. And it didn't have ball bearing before we worked on it. It's probably the same bearing we put in there. This was on a rope. The valve was out there. It's easy enough to just get the valve and have it right here. That was simpler. We put the wiring in EMT conduit to keep it closed in. This was open. This was totally open. We sealed this in to keep the noise away. We wanted to make it a little bit nicer. One thing I did that was kind of a mistake, I reused the gas tank that they had here, not knowing that it was a goofy gas tank out of some other piece of equipment turned sideways. So the baffles don't really work, and it made the fuel gauge not work as well as it should. I don't know if they forgot that. I had it working, but it didn't work at first, and I had to change to another style of sending unit, but that sending unit didn't last real long. I put 2 of them in it while it was on warranty. I don't know if it's working now or not. Part of why they wanted gas. They wanted gas on this because instead of diesel, not because of the noise, that's something a lot of people would think of, and we could have dampened the noise down on the little diesel. Reason they wanted gas is because at the park, they use a whole lot of hand equipment. They use leaf blowers, they use little chainsaws, weed cutters. They use all this little stuff, and instead of having to have a couple 100 gallons of gas throughout the year in separate places, they have a place for keeping 1,000 gallons of gas. By running it in here, it keeps the gas turned over and they have fresh gas. So when they explained that to me, of course, it made perfect sense. Yeah, you know, it was up to them, and that's why they chose gasoline engine. They wanted to keep it running. As long as we're doing a gasoline engine, the one that had been in it made the most sense. 300 cubic inch, 6-cylinder industrial. But Larry, back to Larry. We got Larry a nice seat, which this is a replacement. They wore out the one I put in here. It had a really cruddy seat before, plus nowhere for your feet. It's actually somewhat comfortable now. He wanted a window that opens. He didn't care about the others, but he wanted to make sure we had one right there that opens. And I don't know what kind of habits you might want to open a window and be able to throw things out, but it's nice to have an old window that opens anyway. So the others didn't really matter to him. I think the front one opens too. I was going to put an opener that matched on this side originally, but they didn't send me a left and a right hand. And as it turned out, I couldn't turn it over either. There's actually an up and down. I forget whether the window falls out or binds or something, but it doesn't work upside down. I halfway think I probably still have the window I bought for this, the other window I bought before we did the fixed ones. Anyway, as this was all going about, I have things that I had decided that was part of the bid, and I would offer all kinds of extra things. After I had won the bid, but before I got the locomotive, Larry decided that he wanted to put a sander on this because he really wanted a sander on the locomotive. In the old days, previous to that, I don't know who would have done this, but I've heard stories of people doing this. They would throttle down the locomotive, take a little coffee can with some sand in it, run out in front of the locomotive, sprinkle it on the 2 wheels, and jump back in the other side real quick before it slowed down or before they got ran over. Little technique needed, and so I can understand where they wanted a sander. The problem, of course, is they don't make an adequate sander for a small locomotive. But Larry decided to put one on here that was just, it was pretty well garbage, and he knew it. Put a little hopper on here, a 90-degree quarter-turn ball valve for a sand to flow through, a little Y, and a couple copper lines going down. And the decision, when I talked to other people, I just quickly talked to some of the people that I was dealing with on the contract, and I said, could I could we add on and build a nice sander, and because it's going to take a little bit. And they're like, nope, you can either put that one back in, whether it works or not, you put that one back in. And I had to cut holes through the new woodwork and the cab, and I just didn't want to do a garbagey job. I didn't want to put this piece of garbage back on here, which everybody knew didn't work. And so I went ahead and volunteered at no charge to go ahead and make a sander for it. And a little valve for running it. It's air actuated. It's right down there. And it's a simple enough sander. I could build this sander for under $3,000, probably $2,000. I could build the sander today. I'd have to build quite a few before I could really be selling them at those kind of prices. But because of trial, error, boo-boos, sand is not always friendly to get it to work right. I had about $20,000 in making this sander work. So let's look at the sander. So put the sander underneath here, have an air cylinder. It's really pretty simple. It's just gravity, cylinder. This is a guide to keep this piece of pipe centered. I forget what I've got for a piece of rubber for sealing. Austin said it had some crusties in here, which they need to keep up on that. Every now and then you got to dump it out. And it doesn't feel too bad. But also Austin was playing with it. He may have broken up all the crusties. You need to have good sand. You can see the little conduits coming down there. There's just two conduits that come out of it. And I think they added the grease fittings. I think I had grease fittings. I think they added the grease fittings after I was done with it. And there's two reasons I say that. One, I don't remember putting them here. And two, I don't think I would have put them next to the sand hopper. I would have found somewhere else to put them where they weren't. That just wouldn't have been what I would do. No, I would not normally do it there, sand hopper. And when we had this up, we had it up on jack stands. We'd put the gearbox in. And the gearbox was interesting too for the next part of it. We had to use double CV joints. There's enough drop between where the gearbox is and where the transmission is. We had to do two CV joints, double H-cross CV joints. Anyway, the driveline makes a little bit of noise, which is interesting. It doesn't hurt anything, but there's a ringing you get in the actual driveline tubing because of the mass of the gears, because we're running with that the Dana 80 and everything else pretty solid in there. It's been running for, and it's just the driveline tubing. It's one of those, if a person like the rubber-filled drivelines would help that. I did another job later on where I had to use a driveline doing a similar thing a little bit after this, where it was driving a heavy mass through U-joints, and I put in a rubber damper and it cut out all that noise. So it's not a mechanical problem, but you do hear it. You hear it when you run it. I didn't hear it when it wasn't, when the wheels weren't fighting the track though, when it was, no load. I didn't hear it up on blocks. But when we ran it up on blocks, what we did notice right away was the whole locomotive going back and forth, because when we made the bigger, better connecting rods, it didn't have enough counterweight. This counterweight here was not enough. So what we have now, the back side of this counterweight area is filled in with lead again. And I did some math and figured out how much weight we'd added and the center of rotation, and I figured it'd be about right, and actually it was quite smooth. You're gonna have something. It's a reciprocating motion, but it's not too bad. It actually was pretty smooth up on jacks once we did that. And I quit sweating the potential problem, and it's been working. 12 volt light up front, which is what it had before. I guess I'm wrong here. They have a different number on this. Everybody gives, okay, it's not number 67. That's just on the front. This is for 1435, but it's still only one that they made. I like to start things at higher numbers when I do stuff. I've made quite a few things with serial number 987 or something like that. Word spherical bearings. We put on new air tanks. The old air tank that it had an old air tank underneath there, and it had the battery box mounted on top of the air tank, which I thought was a really bad thing to have a potential acid spill sitting on top of a pressure vessel. The old air tank is actually now the shelf for the sander. And we just put in new DOT spec truck air tanks. Mounted away from the battery box, which is in a marine box over there separate with little fuses and ground disconnect. The painting, that was another interesting little side point. I don't remember the man's name. He is getting up there in years. When this came to the park, they painted pretty much this scene on here in 1967. And which that's something I'm a little unhappy with. They've moved the gas vent so that the overflow, so it's starting to, the other side. Let's go to the other side. The other side still looks better. Not as bright though, but anyway, they pretty much did this in 67. Before we took it apart, sandblasted it, painted the black on. Before we did any of that, I took good pictures of it so that we could document what it was. Well, I went around hunting for sign painters, and sign painters that use real paint, doing real sign stuff, are kind of a thing of the past. I think I've heard of a few of them starting up again in some places again because now it's artsy. And even though it was the same guy, I ended up getting a hold of the same guy that painted it in 67. And he wanted to use decals. So I showed him what we had. He didn't really remember doing it. He remembered doing the locomotive, but he didn't remember how the lettering and stuff was. I said, I want it as close to the original as you can get it. Well, he came up with these decals. He put them on, and I was like, it looked like 1985 disco pop. I just, no. It was totally wrong. Just no. Pull those off. And I got him to redo it. And then he did it by hand, same way, and it looked really close to what he had done in 1967. So if we did it again, since there are people doing like the automotive wraps, different things, I think today we probably would do a wrap type of a style. And that could come out good with what's available today. But what they had at that time as far as just strictly cutting a few different colors and backgrounds, it didn't look good. It was not the same thing. I've seen some really, really good wraps and stuff today. I think it could be done. If a person found a good sign painter though, I'm sure there's people that can learn it yet. Just the fact that there wasn't one around to have other than it happened to be the same guy that ended up doing it. So I felt pretty good about that. These things here they added later on. They added on as they were having, which they've had flange problems right from the start, even early on, because their tracks are so tight. A 30-foot radius is pretty small, and that's pretty tight in locomotive world. So anyway, they have a little wax applier that puts wax on the flange so that when it hits they used to use grease, and then the grease would mix with the sand, and we have some slipping and some driving, and this is working better for them. They can still use the sand and have have a little bit of a wax coat on the wheel. I think I will. I'll check back with what specs I did last time. I'll do a little bit of math looking at how much it's going to be able to center on that 30-foot radius. And I might not be able to get it to go perfect, but I'm going to give it a little bit more of a taper when we cut these wheels, so it'll self-center a little better around the corners. but there is a limit to how quick you can get it to center. They slow down on the corners. The normal upper speed on this is 15. I think it will do 20, 25, somewhere in there. I've seen it doing 15. Before I did the gearbox, I changed the ratio in this gearbox. Before I put in this gearbox, this silly thing would have done 70. It didn't have much for starting power, but it was high geared. It was high geared. We changed it. We changed it. And if I were doing it again with this experience, I would go further yet. But I hadn't had experience with it on the rails to see what we're doing. And 10 miles an hour is what they want as an average speed. What I did, since I had a backhoe with the same reverser, forward, backwards, it's Borg-Warner Velvet Drive. Anyway, with that same transmission in it, we took my backhoe. Now, of course, it was wrong because everything was on rubber, but I took my backhoe in here and I took the same poundage of pickups. We daisy chained them with chains, and I tried it in different gears to see what left me with a reasonable acceleration without wasting a lot. And so I found where I had plenty of acceleration without too much. Anyway, so I played with it because I had 4-speed transmission. And I think I ended up in second gear, and so then I duplicated that gearing versus the tire size for what we had here. And yeah, we'll probably find some things to point out here and there as we get it apart. And we'll give you all of the pictures that you can look at, ask me questions, and I can talk and put them on, because I've got a whole file of stills of this. There's quite a few things we've done in this shop in the past. I mean, this was 19 years ago. We've done a lot of things in this shop that you just don't see on the internet from me, because all we've got is a few stills here or there, or nothing, you know. But it's, another one we did is when we did the roof on the cab, we put rivets up there. I bought a bunch of regular rivets and cut them off so that it looked, so it matched. Same size rivets as what they've got on the side here that also don't do anything but decorate. I said, I need some of those on the roof when we're doing the roof. Before, it just had a plywood roof. I couldn't see that again. Like I say, we're sealing it in. Let's put a roof on it that's going to stay there. Solid 1/8-inch piece of steel is, in fact, is I don't know why I probably put the seam in there because I wanted to make it look good. I'm sure there's a seam of rivets down the middle too with those two pieces. There's got to be. Because I could have bought a sheet that wide enough to do that without, I had to have put that in for decoration, which is a little overkill. Nobody's climbing on top of it to look at it. Yeah, we'll find something else as we pull it apart. I don't know if we're going to work on the back wheels or not, because they hadn't really authorized the extra work. I need to talk to them this next week. We get started on the front and talk to them about whether they want to spend extra money to do the back ones or not. The front ones really need it because the driving tapers. The back ones follow a little better, but the back ones still have a flange that's sticking up. That bolt in the switch that they're concerned about, those back ones are going to hit the switch. And I think they're going to have the same problem with car wheels, a lot of stuff. So we will see, and yep, that's how it got here. That's why it's here.